Alright boys and girls, this is Brad from EastCoastAngel, and today we're going to be doing an LCD teardown. Well, as you can see here, we have a rare model today. It's a die LCD, and it comes from Paul. He was gracious enough to send it in, and I decided I wanted to do the LCD teardown with this because it's a little bit more unique, and I think that you guys deserve a treat occasionally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you a rundown right now of what I use for tools. First and foremost, I like to tell people that a gauge is necessary because it gives you your LPR readout, which is awesome, and it allows you to fine tune. The next thing I'll use this for leverage occasionally when getting out the vertical ASA bolt, and also leverage for when I need to pull out the pins, in which you'll see that later. Always have a pick available. It's good for taking off O-rings off of the all of the internals, and it allows you to clean out like crevices and stuff like that, like, you know, areas like this. Always keeping these areas clean is a plus. The next thing I like to use a lot is my wooden spoon. Everybody kind of, you know, it's kind of a running gag at the moment, but I use it because it doesn't gouge the internals when I go to push out the ram and push out the valve body and the LPR. It's wood, it won't damage them, and I've noticed in the past people have used almost everything to try to get those out, and they have ruined the insides of those channels. If you gouge them and scratch them up bad enough, you will need to have them refinished, and the O-rings will need to be changed out from what Angel uses to what possibly an American you know, paintball manufacturer uses. If you have that gun forever and you never sell it or trade it, then you will know the difference, but the person that you sell it or trade it to may not. Again, use the proper tools. In this case, the proper tool is a wooden dowel, or you can use a squeegee. You know, again, don't use anything metallic to push out these internals. I also use pipe cleaners for when I pull out the pins. I will run a pipe cleaner through each area, get all of the you know, anything that's been sitting down in here. When I pull out the pins, if they're really, really gnarly, then I know I definitely need to use pipe cleaners at that point. I've got my Leatherman tool here. Usually I only use it to tap out the reg internals. It's a nice flat solid surface. I've had that thing forever. I do recommend using a really quality grease when doing your O-rings. I use Eclipse grease just due to the fact that it is readily available at any and all paintball shops. Even ones that don't necessarily sell a lot of Planet Eclipse, they usually will have their grease because it's very popular. The next thing I like is I've got a set of jeweler's pliers. They're really easy and simple to acquire. You can go to any hobby store and they will allow you to get the circlip out of the reg and remove the circlip off of the back plate. They have circlip pliers also. If you want to spend a little bit more money, you can get those at most hardware stores. The next thing I'm going to point out is I've got the Angel toolkit, and which has all of the sizes that I need. These, you know, these Allen keys are really rugged. They don't round as easily as the black oxide ones do, and that's why I use them. They are shorter, so, you know, technically, you know, you may end up running into taking a little bit more time. If you use long-handled stuff like this, you know, it's better, you know, quicker, but again, may not be readily available and or may not be as rugged as the original Angel toolkits. The next thing that I want to point out is I like to use actual tools that Angel supplied, you know, online, and kind of, you know, as a, you know, here, if you're going to work on your own gun, do it the right way. You've got a ram tool. It's got two prongs. It goes into the back of the ram, and you can thread the ram out and you can thread the ram in. The other thing I want to point out today is I have the snap ring tool, which not a lot of people are familiar with this, but if you're into fine tuning, then you'll know exactly what this is. This part and this part go hand in hand. You slide that in after you put the two prongs into your back of your ram. You remove the brass snap ring retainer, and you can use this to fine tune where you want your snap ring to be, and then you put the plug back in, to roughly where this is. And then after you find your sweet spot on your ram, you're good to go. You go ahead and you can put a light, you know, when I say light, I mean the actual integrity of the Loctite. You want to look at the range, not necessarily the color, because Loctite colors are all over the place. Look at the range that it requires for it to break free. You want to use a light one, and you can put a little bit on the brass plug and hold it in place, because they do back out. I have seen that happen, in which people have been like, my gun's not working. You know, I adjusted the ram, and I'm like, okay, did you put anything on the snap ring when you put it back in? And they were like, no. And I'm like, that probably is backed out. So again, this is, you know, kind of optimal if you want to be able to fine tune. And then of course you have your LPR piston removal tool, in which this piece just screws into the piston and the LPR. You can pull it out and you can add or subtract shims depending on the tuning that you're trying to do. But now we're going to get right down to it. I have Paul's die LCD. It's got some wear on it. It's been a shooter's gun, but it's still a die LCD. I mean, come on. These things don't come up every day, and if I have the opportunity to make a video with one of them, I am going to take it. So I do appreciate it, Paul. Again, it's a beauty. It's got the jewel, and it's got a whole plethora of die LCD parts on it. This one isn't exactly 100% you know, die LCD, just due to the fact that it's got the clamping feed neck, which I recommend one of these, just because, you know, it keeps your hopper, you know, properly positioned, which is never a bad thing. It also has the Crystal Soya no slop trigger, in which, you know, it usually will keep your side-to-side play down. It's a plus. The one thing that you're going to want to do, though, is if you ever install one of those triggers, is make sure that your grip screws are not too long, then they pinch the trigger shut. You know, that's kind of like a common occurrence with these. But again, you can see it's all there, and we're going to go ahead and get right to it. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by removing the airline. Typically, I like to try to remove anything that's going to be non-essential, and that would be obviously the airline. This time around, I'm going to leave the ASA on the frame, though, because of the fact that these screws are different than the metric, so I don't have them right handy. If I, you know, thought it was going to be a problem, I would definitely fish them out. But I'm going to go ahead and we can unscrew the reg right there. Going to give you a quick tutorial on the teardown of the reg. It's super simple. You take your circlip pliers or your jeweler's pliers, and one thing when you're taking this apart, you're going to want to kind of contain the circlip, because it is a spring activated device. These things will ricochet and fly all over the place if you don't kind of contain them. Typically, I also like to keep my area really clean, just because of the fact that this will blend in with a lot of things. If it just gets dropped down there, you know, you're looking around, you're like, oh, you know, I don't see where it is. I mean, it literally can just, you know, blend into darker colors and stuff like that. Again, if these things fly all over the place, you're going to have a fun time trying to find them. So now that we've got that out of the way, bring out the trusty Leatherman, and we'll drop out the big piston, and we'll drop out the little piston and the ball bearing. Now, one other thing we have here is we have the velocity adjust screw, and which I always like to take out, mainly because of the fact that grit and dirt gets inside there, and when it does, it can make it hard to adjust the velocity. At that point, I can unscrew it, I can clean out the threads, I can make sure everything is proper. This one came out nice, there was no grit or anything. Paul's actually quite particular when it comes to his equipment, so I wouldn't expect anything less, you know, when working on his stuff. You know, meaning, you know, he's not going to have over torque screws, he's not going to have strip screws, he's not going to have, you know, parts that are covered in grit and dirt and everything like that. This is actually a collector gun. You know, it's still very popular on the secondary market, so keeping it in good shape is a huge plus. So there's that. The one thing I did notice when I was taking this apart is the O-ring is completely flattened on this. It should be above the brass. It's not. It's almost flush with it, and it's actually starting to tack up, which means that this is bad. We'll replace it. It's no big deal. We have these available. We go ahead and swap those out. Boom, you get better velocity adjustment. The one thing I do want to point out is with the reg piston, the shims are going, in different directions. There's also different amounts of shims that are going in different directions. The one thing you want to do when taking this apart is to keep an eye on how you're taking it apart. If you feel that, this gun, or a gun in particular has been taken apart before by somebody that may or may not have known what they were doing, consult the manual or look up online exactly how everything goes, because like with this one's set up properly. You've got 3 shims down on the very bottom, and they are they're dish shaped. They look like cymbals. So these ones at the very bottom, there's 3 of them, and they kind of go that way. So and then we've got these, and they're that way, and they go, there's 2 of them, and they go up against that. And then the very last ones are shaped again like that, and they go that way. So if they're not set up properly, you're going to find you're going to be very disappointed with your velocity. It's going to be erratic. It's going to be higher than it should be or lower than it should be. Again, consult the manual if you have any questions at all with that, just because of the fact that it's better to have a properly running Angel than one that's sitting in a box somewhere not being used. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the grips off, because I want to take apart the I want to take the frame off. I want to take the board out of the frame, show you how that's done. You go ahead and take off. There's 6 screws that hold the grips on, and this particular one, because the grips are aftermarket and they're more rigid plastic, I'm going to take off all 6 screws. Normally I wouldn't. Normally I would take off just 3. I would flip open the panel, and then I would take, and unplug the electronics. But these are rigid, and they tend to break and crack down here, just due to age, and also just due to the actual makeup of the grip itself is a different composite than what Angel used. So we want to, like I said, I want to take care of this one. I don't want Paul to be getting something back with broken parts or having to replace parts, because I just wasn't thinking. So we go ahead, and at that point you go unplug the battery charge port and just slide them off. Real simple and easy. Like I said, these are more rigid, and they tend to split right where they're actually molded together. So there's that, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the plugs, undo those, the battery plug and the solenoid plug. Right now we're kind of at that point where we can go ahead and we can remove the frame. This one's got a liquid snatch grip on it, which is kind of cool. Go ahead and take that right off also. There was a lot of aftermarket support for the LCD. That was kind of, one of the big pluses when I went and made them my private label. I wanted to go with something that was a classic, something that everyone was, could recognize right off the bat. There's a lot of aftermarket support. A lot of parts were available. You could buy almost everything. You could get feed necks, you could get triggers, you could get breech knobs, vertical ASAs, volleys. Oh my lord, you could buy like a new volley every week and probably not own all of them. Every company made them, tons of people. Which is awesome, because you could actually, just literally customize this gun to your exact taste. The board's held in with 2 screws, and they are the same size as the back plate, so there's no worries there on being oh man, if I lose one of these, what am I going to do? They're really easy to relocate also. You know, there's two, top and bottom. The one thing that I thought was really cool about this one, it still had the protective plate on the back, and you know, in the frame. It's just a clear sheet, but what it does is it protects the back of the board. All the circuitry and all of the solder points are back there, and so it kind of adds a little bit more of a protective layer. And this was original, so that's kind of cool that it's still with it. Now we're pretty much all done. There's 3 buttons back here that can be removed. They just pop right out. The trigger, like I was saying earlier, is a chrysalis soya no slop trigger, which is kind of neat. The one thing that I tend to tell people is, if you're going to be getting into a full teardown and stuff like that, you're possibly going to be taking out the trigger pin. And if you do that, you're going to want to be careful. They typically only come out one way. The one thing I have noticed is this one's got some dings and dents around it. So somebody, when they were taking it out, they had probably they didn't have the proper tools when doing it. And essentially, I'm going to show you half of the proper tooling. You have a punch, which is proper, and then you have something that you can use to tap it out. I use, like I said, my Leatherman usually comes in handy doing all kinds of stuff. Most of the time, if your LCD has a aftermarket trigger on it, it's probably, the pin's probably going to come out really easily. It's the stock ones that were really pressed right in there. And if you look at this, again, if you're shooting the gun, or if you're holding the frame like you're shooting the gun, the pin is always going to come out the left. If you try to hammer it through, out the right, you are going to hog out that hole that is actually tapered to hold this pin in. There's a reason for everything with an Angel. Everything's got a purpose. They really didn't make something and put something into their gun that didn't have a purpose. That was the greatest thing. They over-engineered them like crazy. They could have made these simpler, but they didn't, because they wanted to make a gun that stood out and that people took notice of. In which case we all do, because you're here, you're watching this video, you realize that you have a good taste and that you enjoy the finer things in life, which would be a high-end paintball gun. So I'm just going to go ahead and move those things off to the side, and we're going to get down to the next piece. One thing at this point, you can see you have plenty of options. You can you could take off the vertical ASA, you can start taking off the back plates and stuff like that. I'm going to go ahead and undo the ball detent, mainly because on this model, I want to show you one thing that's really kind of cool. They milled a lot of the side right here, so they put a spacer, and you're going to, if you replace the ball detent, you're going to want to make sure that that spacer is placed back on there, because if you don't, this will go and screw all the way in, and it will cause bolt issues. Again, this is only on this model, and I believe the Adrenaline Feather also has a spacing issue too. And if you don't add the O-ring properly, it will screw itself into the breech far enough that the bolt will hit this, and you'll cause issue. If you don't notice it and the bolt hits it and it keeps doing it, or it gets stuck and hung up and you're trying to shoot it, you can also damage your ram. So keep that in mind. This ball detent has great spring. It's clean inside and out, so we're going to go ahead and reuse that. That won't be a problem. And now we're going to go ahead and take off the vertical ASA. There's a manifold plate that's actually a 2-piece. There are O-rings, and I have the O-rings off to the side already, just due to the fact that at one point I noticed that my video, the quality of it wasn't up to par, so I ended up redoing the video, and so I didn't put the O-rings back in. But there are 3 O-rings. I'll show you where those go. There's 2 bolts right here, you can see, one inside. That one you might need to use a little bit of leverage, especially if you're using a smaller and shorter Allen key and you can't quite get it. That's where this little guy comes in handy. Just go ahead and a little leverage, boom, done. like I said before, Paul takes care of his stuff. Nothing was over torqued, nothing was you know, stripped. It was actually a pleasure to work on. Now we have you know, these two pieces. You got your manifold plate and you've got your vertical ASA. There's an O-ring that goes from there, you know, in this recessed area that seals off that, and then there's an O-ring that goes here where the bolt goes up through, and another one that goes off to the side that actually transfers you know, the air from the vertical ASA into the body. So there's that right there. Awesome. And now essentially what I want to do is I want to replace the I want to take off and remove the back plate, but in order for me to do that I have to pull out the breech knob. I'm going to go ahead and remove the bolt. He has a soft face bolt in this, which is a great upgrade. It allows the ball to sit a little bit further in, you know, and right up against the detent like it should, and not allow it to roll back. And when it rolls back, sometimes you'll get clipping because the next ball will drop down in, and then when you go to, you know, the bolt goes and releases the air, it does travel a little ways into the breech, and if the ball isn't sitting where it's properly should, another ball will come down, and at that point you'll get clipping, which is no good. These bolts were available in the 03 and 04 speeds all the way up to the 05 speed, and again, if you can find one, they're a great upgrade for the LCD. Now typically what I do here, a lot of people have asked me, how do you take off the breech knob? And you know, because it wants to just keep going back in, just go ahead and place my finger at the end of the breech knob, the rod, and I push it, and then we can go ahead and you can thread it off. Again, over engineering, but it's a lovely thing, especially with these markers. So we're gonna go ahead, and that's done. That's done. Put my screws. I like to try to kind of keep everything in place. I've got OCD and ADD, so I like, you know, staying busy, but I also like to keep all of my areas clean. Now we're kind of gotten to that point where we're going to get ready to take the back plate off. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to explain to you that there is a spring, obviously, for the breech rod, and you're going to want to keep an eye on that. Keeping your area clean helps you find stuff that tends to fall off of your gun or tends to come apart as you're taking it apart. It will, you know, decide to take off on you. It's kind of a good thing to, you know, keep your area clean. Also, with this sort of, you know, situation, kind of keep it contained, because I've seen these just rocket right out of here. You know, this one didn't, which is great, but I have seen these things fly right out and disappear. I swear the floor just eats them, because I found that I've never found these after, and I don't know where they go. And that's so frustrating, because you can hear it hit the ground, or you can hear it rolling away from you, but you can never find it. So there's the spring, there's the breech pin. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out is this one's really clean, which is nice. It does have the spring retaining pin still left on it in good shape. The threads are in good shape, so this would be an item that can be reinstalled. I do put a little bit of grease on it when I put it back in, just because these will collect corrosion. This one's been cleaned before, I can see by, you know, the marking on it, but you know, they will collect corrosion. At that point, it makes it harder to get them out of the body. So put a little bit of grease on there. Preventative maintenance is nice. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the back plate off. It screws on to the battery on-off switch. And if you look over here, you'll notice that there's an O-ring. There's a reason for that, because that way you don't end up putting this too far in, so that switch sticks way out. It's nice, you know, and it's just one of those things you're going to want to leave in there when you go to put it back together. Now I'm going to show you, there is two differences with these circlips. One, they look the same, which is awesome, great, but they are not. If you noticed, when I was taking this one out of the reg, I had to squeeze it in order to get it to compress in. This one, you actually have to spread it, which is nice because you can never confuse the two. You can see there's a size difference also, but you can never confuse the two. You wouldn't be able to fit that one into the reg, and you wouldn't be able to use this one on, you know, like vice versa, because of the way that they, you know, operate. This one expands out and this one expands in. Pretty sweet. The majority of the parts that I'm showing you that come off and that, you know, could easily be damaged or whatnot are available. All you have to do is give us a shout. You can go ahead and leave comments below and we will get back to you. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the front plug off where the battery chamber is. You can take off the volley if you want to, if it's in the way or whatever. You know, I'm just going to wait for a second, take this one off, show you that battery removal and installation, super easy. Takes a minute. There's an O-ring on the end of this. It's essentially to keep the plug from backing out. It does not, there's no sealing, there's no air in this side, so you don't have to worry about it. If it's, you know, if it's in good shape, awesome. If it's missing, put a new one on it. You know, they're, you know, you know, just kind of like one of those things that, again, over-engineering, but you know, it's something that we're used to if we shoot angels. You know, I can go ahead and take the volumizer off. Again, it was kind of like a novelty item. They do say supposedly it reduces pressures on certain models and whatnot. I mean, honestly, this thing doesn't have that much, you know, chamber volume. I don't believe that this would, you know, drastically change the operating of your LCD, but it certainly looks cool. Now what I do is when I'm taking the battery out, I tend to fish out the solenoid wires first, just because of the fact that they kind of get in the way and that plug will snag the battery wires. I've seen wires and I've seen ends get pulled right off by trying to extract, you know, the battery out of there. You know, and it's preventative. If you don't have to damage something, then don't. You know, soldering wires, no big deal for me, but for some people, they couldn't solder to save their life. So if that's the case, just, you know, take a little bit more time, be a little bit more patient, and everything will come out like it should. This battery pack was provided by Angel Paintball Parts. Usually he puts a sticker right on here, but there is not one. It makes great, you know, rechargeable batteries. Uses the stock, you know, plug-in and the stock switch, but he uses a different kind of wire, and this is good because this is flexible. You can bend it, you can squish it, you can, you know, jam it back in there, you know, in the battery tube, and it doesn't get damaged. Whereas these original wires have a little bit more, you know, they've got a bit of a drawback because they can get damaged easily. I have seen these shear off and break with, you know, age, depending on where your marker is also situated. Like if it's been in a really, you know, hot environment or a really cold environment a lot, these the plastic surrounding the wires can break down really quickly. And again, you know, just take care when you know, taking your marker apart, and you don't have to worry about it. So now we're kind of at that point where, you know, we can make a decision. Do we want to take out the internals or do we want to take out the solenoid? I'm going to go ahead and do the solenoid just because it's right here. You know, it's super easy to do. It uses the same Allen key as the backplate screws and the board screws. You just go ahead and get those out. This is another thing too that I like to point out. These don't have to be torqued on. I find that these are stripped out more than not because people really just rail on them when putting them back together. The one thing I will point out is the front one, the one I'm working on now, actually holds the plug that separates the housing from the solenoid housing. There's a little plastic plug in there, and this particular screw holds that in place. So this one will have a little bit more resistance when putting it, you know, back in. But again, you don't have to go crazy with it. You know, just make sure that you have it lined up when putting it back in. And you know, when it gets to a certain point and it's snug in the front to hold this down and it's holding that, that's all you need to do, because it doesn't seal anything. It's strictly decorative. If you could, you know, if you buy a marker that doesn't have this and you want to run it, you can. This is all self-contained. It uses a hold down screw and a gasket. So, I mean, literally this is not necessary. It's aesthetic. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the First, I'm going to grab the wrong size Allen key, and then here we go, and just back that off, kind of twist that off to the side. The one thing I do want to point out, the ram removal tool that we talked about earlier will put this back in properly. 2 prongs, go ahead, you can turn it, and the one cool thing, you take your Allen key, you line it up, and then you can tighten it back up without it moving. It's pretty awesome. Again, there are certain tools and they're made a certain way because it makes taking these apart easier, and that's just one of them right there. At this point, we go ahead and lift the solenoid out, and this one's the gasket's going to sit down in here. So go ahead and pluck that out. Mainly what I like to do is I like to take a look at the gasket, and I like to make sure that it's in good shape. This one's got, you know, some grease on it, which is no big deal. It's not saturated in oil. Also, it doesn't have you know, a whole bunch of compression. It looks like it's in really good shape. Awesome, good to go. One other thing that I do want to point out, in between the solenoid and the base, there's another gasket. It's held tight by screws on the top. Typically, you won't have to replace those. That's the awesome part about, you know, gaskets. Sometimes you don't have to replace them, but I do recommend that if you're going to, is to tighten them. Make sure that, you know, that the screws are tight. Don't over tighten them. You don't have to go nuts, but, you know, just make sure that they're tight. That way, if you get any sort of leaking from back here, you know that it's not from there, or you know, it's not from there. The one thing I will point out now is if you're going to take the breech pins out, which we're going to, you know, and you need a pin, you know, a screw to be able to pull them out. These set screws that hold the plate, hold the base plate on, are the same size that you're going to need to remove the pin. Now, if the pins are going to, you know, come out easy, you can go ahead and reuse one of these and then throw it back into your solenoid. If they're going to be, you know, harder or more difficult, I recommend going to your, you know, local hardware store. Mom and pop stores that have a good fastener section will have the proper screws, and I believe they're 1.5 millimeter, or they might be 2 millimeter, you know, threaded. And those will help you get the breech pins out. So now we've gotten to that point where I like to just pull out the internals and essentially winding down on this teardown. If they don't come out, you know, right away, it's probably because this is spring loaded, and the, you know, the LCD has an inline all on one side, all of your internals, the ram, the valve, and the LPR. The LPR is spring-loaded, and sometimes I notice if you put a little bit of pressure on it, you can pull the pin out. This one just wants to be difficult, so we'll go ahead and we'll use the pliers. And there's that. And like I said, it's spring-loaded, so you let go of it, you notice it just moved up. That is, you know, very common, very typical. You know, sometimes these pins like to sit in place just because, you know, they're snug. Machining was pretty spot on with these, but you're going to find sometimes they will, you know, they'll stay right where they want to. These all have, you know, grease on them, which is awesome. It keeps them clean, keeps them proper, you know, and, you know, that's never a bad thing. Those are actually the cleanest pins that I've seen in a long time, which is great because it's kind of important when taking a gun apart that everything is, you know, clean and proper. It just makes everything so much easier. We're going to go ahead and use the ram removal tool, and we're going to back out the ram. You know, I think it's got like half a dozen threads on it, not a whole lot, might have a little bit more. But after you get it to a certain point where it's cleared all of the threads out, you might be able to grab a hold of it. If you can't, no big deal. Just go ahead and put your Allen key in there in the breech slot, and then just back it out. Awesome. Sometimes you might find that it might be a little bit more difficult. This is interesting, actually. As you can see, the ram has separated from the front. which means that at some point this ram's probably been taken apart, and when it was put back together, they didn't use the Loctite to put the two bodies back together. So now we're going to show you exactly what happens when the ram's not put back together with Loctite. It'll come apart. Super cool, because now I can service the O-ring that's in here, and we can make sure that this thing runs optimal for years to come. You know, you have, you know, it's actually kind of interesting because now I can show you all the little pieces and parts. This piece is pressed on. It doesn't move. It stays right where it is. There's an O-ring right here. This is going to be the O-ring that's going to go bad if there's ever a leak inside here. You have a little small bumper or a sweep, which keeps the ram shaft clean. It does mushroom up and seal up when this goes forward at full stroke. Again, this piece screws in here. There should be some sort of resistance. The O-ring should have a sealing property. You should be able to feel it when you put the two pieces back together. Again, this one had to have been taken apart at one point because these do not unthread by themselves like this. I thought it was really cool though, because now I can service that O-ring and I can give them it back, and it's been completely done. Yeah, in fact, actually, there it is. There's a mark right there where somebody used tools to hold on to the front end and be able to back out the other. They didn't damage the channel where the O-ring goes, so it's awesome. Again, you want to make sure when you're doing this that the hammer has been Loctited in place, because if that moves forward at all, it can destroy the valve. I've got numerous examples where the hammer has unthreaded itself and it just beats on the valve body and cracks where the stem goes through, and at that point you're looking at a full replacement. So again, inspect all your parts when taking everything apart. It's super easy to do. It's one of those things. It's just it will help in the long run. You'll find that your marker will run so much better when all the parts are proper and all the parts have been inspected and they're been taken care of. So we are all done with the body for the most part. We do have the breech pins. I'm going to show you that removal in a minute. But here's your LPR. You have shims here, and you have symbol shims, and then you also have thin shims. Your thin shims will bump up your LPR's pressure. Again, if you have a gauge and you're using it properly, you'll notice it goes up in increments. When you add a shim, it'll bump it up approximately 3 to 5 psi per shim is what I've been noticing. And optimally, your LCD should run between 75 and 100 psi on your gauge. And then, of course, you can fiddle around with it a little bit. I tend to run a little bit higher dwell on my board. I like 14. I found that is really kind of like the sweet spot for the dwell. It allows for it to activate the solenoid properly. Gives it plenty of time for recharge, but also it gives you a little softer shot. So I'm going to go ahead and put that off to the side. And like I said, you've got your valve stem and your valve body. You want to make sure that there's no excessive grit in here. I've seen these completely covered in dirt, because if you open up this area, you've got your valve air chamber in which stuff can get down in there. And I've seen these things get completely, havoc. This one's in really good shape. You always want to make sure that this face is solid and attached to the stem. If this moves or it moves this way, you got to replace it. It's going to give you problems. Your velocity is going to suffer. All right, breech pin removal, the fun stuff. Go ahead and put that off to the side, put that up there, no big deal. Breech pin removal is, I joke about it, it's no big deal. I've never run into ones that I haven't been able to get out, but I have heard some really awesome stories. People have saturated their guns in WD-40 for days. I've seen people that have used heat, to a point where, it's just, wow. It's like seems excessive, but it isn't, because sometimes these things can get stuck right in there. Right now what I'm doing is I'm removing both of the set screws or grub screws that are on the ends. You can see there's some, you know, grit coming out here. Just go ahead and wipe that off. Get, you know, keep all your you know, all your threads and all your screws clean. Use a Dremel with a wire wheel if you need to, you know, keep the you know, screw threads clean. You know, I tend to do that on extreme cases. Like I said, everything so far that I've been taking off has been in really good shape, so I'm not going to go nuts with that. But there's that right there. Give me just a second so I can get my screws that I have set aside for this particular part of the teardown. Now, like I said before, it's a, I believe 1.5, might be a 2 millimeter threaded screw, and that goes right into the back of the, you know, the breech pin. They are see, got the wrong size. Let me grab the right size. Here we go. All right, they're threaded right in here, and you want to go ahead and make sure that you put a good amount of thread in there, and only because of the fact that if you go and you start pulling out the thread, you know, the threaded breech rod, and you pull out threads because you didn't put it in enough, it's just going to make it that much harder when taking them back out. So what I like to do is I like to put, you know, a pretty good amount of thread in them, and at this point I like to use my adjustable. It's got a rubber handle on it, so it doesn't damage anything. Then I use a Leatherman, which allows me the leverage that I need to pull the pin out. And just like that. Now, you can see that got bent. No big deal. You just bend it right back. And then you can back that out. The pins are actually in really good shape. The front of the pins, where most of your exposure is and where your stuff can get down in the sides, will get that'll get, you know, Dremeled, wire wheeled. This will get all cleaned up. Put grease on these when you put them back in, though. That's the only thing that I you know, that I recommend, and it's the one thing that I do every time, you know, when I'm taking and doing a full restoration on a gun. This is, you know, not a full restoration because the marker's actually in really good shape as it sits. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to make sure that it is clean and O-rings are replaced and it's tuned, so he can take it out and he can shoot it without worrying about anything breaking down on him. The one thing I did notice is when I was putting this pin in, the screw in this one pin, is that the breech block moved and everything like that, which means that this one might be situated in there. But hey, look at that, we got lucky. And as you can see, this one's definitely got more grit on it. No big deal, like I said. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna hit it with the Dremel. I'm gonna clean it right up. You know, you're going to run into situations in which, you know, some of these pins are going to be, you know, they're going to be grimy. This one's, you know, it's setting right in, you know, which unfortunately that's the way it goes. I might end up talking with Paul and seeing if he wants them replaced completely, or we can clean them up first and see if that's going to be, you know, good enough for him. Again, it's worth putting a little bit more money into because it's a rare model. But there you go. There's your LCD teardown. You know, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them below. The one thing I do want to point out before we go, though, is the breech O-ring is right here. These tend to just disappear all the time, essentially because the adhesive will wear off. When you go to put a new one in, I know it's going to be kind of unsightly, but scratch off the anodizing that's underneath the O-ring, just in the recessed area. Scratch that off. It gives you your super glue, something to grab onto, and then you go ahead and you press the you know, the O-ring back in. One thing I like to do after I've got it set in is just take and I just kind of massage over it, you know, and roll over it to set it in place. And then, you know, if you need to, you can use nail polish and it will clean up the super glue and will leave no no residue, no trace. But there you have it. The feed neck would be easy to remove. I would take the clamp off of it. I put a butter knife in between the slots and back it off. You know, a little bit of heat if needed, because sometimes they'll use thread locker. But this time around, I'm going to leave it on there because I know it would come off really easily, and then I'd have to, you know, thread lock it back on there and whatnot. Not even necessary. Again, if you have any questions at all, post them below, and I will get back to you. Thank you for tuning in, and good luck if you're going to be doing this yourself.